a different context. So for me, the essential point is to give them the tool to use the language effectively versus making them critical thinkers within the classroom and perhaps triggering some sort of, I don't know, negative response or offending someone.
So we're better off, in a way, to see our students as individuals rather than mark them out as cultural beings.
Absolutely.
Is what you're saying. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, just going back to the beginning when I introduced myself, I don't think you can judge me fairly based on any of those.
No,
and if that's just me, I'm sure there are millions out there like that. So that's kind of the point.
Thanks.
Yeah. It also seems to me that culturally we attach too much importance to culture because people are basically doing the same things in different ways, and I think perhaps we can point out to students that they act in this way because this is what perhaps they believe. Instead of saying we do it this way, we're right, which tended to be the old imperialistic way of teaching English. But perhaps what is needed is awareness and understanding of different approaches which can be understood and then accepted.
I think that's a good start to the whole strategy. And just from speaking to these students and interacting with, I taught in New York as well for a few years, the problems that the students are going through, even these issues of who am I, seem to be universal. So it then goes back to the labeling. For example, is the student acting out because he's from X culture, which is aggressive, or is he just being a teenager? You know,
Yeah.
So I think these are the basic foundations that we may need to go back to instead of looking so deeply at, you know, who's this person's identity? Have I offended him, or what does it mean? There's still a universal language, I think, of humanity. I think it's still out there.
Yeah, and then you find that superficially people are practicing perhaps some customs and behaviour from other cultures in order to interact. So Japanese stop bowing and start shaking hands, but do Americans stop bowing?
Yes, and exactly, that's a very good point. It's also looking at how culture seems to be, the focus seems to be just one way, that these Kuwaitis, they're drinking Starbucks lattes. But what about, let's say, the Americans who are eating Indian food? You know, I don't see them changing. That aspect of it is not being questioned. What does that mean? That they're more assured in their cultural identity, but these students are not? So I think the balance needs to be, it's not balanced at the moment, but it should be. Yes.
I think there's a large number, I won't go so far as to say a majority, but maybe someone else will, of English teachers who are not aware, or they choose not to pay any attention to any aspect of their students' cultural background. I'm not saying that they should take every culture into consideration, but they should be at least responsible enough to say, who are my students? To at least have an idea of what would be the best approach. What type of educational background do they have? You know, what learning strategies or preferences do they have, so that we can find the best way for them to learn, acquire the necessary tools so they can obtain their objectives. But I think in our profession, there's probably more teachers that don't pay any attention to that than there are those who do.
I hope so, and I hope they would speak out and say that this is, I think, and again, this is just my personal opinion, but I think that is the right way to go about it. That while you have a general awareness of who your students are, you don't want to be disrespectful, you don't want to tread, cross any boundaries that shouldn't be. But again, just going back to the foundation of teaching. I don't know if I understood your comment correctly, but I think it's if the majority of teachers do not take it into consideration, then I think that's good.
Okay, I think I meant the opposite. I think they should at least know who their students are, not to change their whole methodology because you are a group of Kuwaiti students, for example, but to at least respect that they might require a different type of methodology instead of imposing one per se that they would use generically for anyone. I mean, I just think the teachers need to be at least responsible enough to find out who their students are.
Right.
Okay.
And I just wouldn't say that, I agree, but I wouldn't say that that has to be culturally connected. It could just
No.
be even within that same classroom. It's just, if you're a teacher, you have to do trial and error, seeing that maybe a majority of students don't learn a specific way and you have to adjust the methodology accordingly. I think my point is that while that may be the case, it doesn't have to be tied to culture. So going back to the fact that it doesn't matter where they're from, it's just the nature of being the student, what type of learner they are, and what works best for them.
I would just like to say that those teachers who don't care about the culture of their students do expect a certain type of cultural behaviour in the classroom, and they have that expectation in ignorance. And my take on what Ayesha is saying, that culture shouldn't matter either. Why should those teachers expect a certain type of cultural behaviour in the classroom? What's that got to do with learning the language? You learn the language like you learn lots of other things in a multiplicity of different ways. How can you impose a particular cultural behaviour in the classroom?
I think it's about having sort of mindfulness, isn't it, in a way? I think what you're talking about is the fact that for a long time, teachers didn't really think about it at all. They didn't think about who their students were, and that caused problems as well. So then we started looking for ways of thinking about who our students were, and we started thinking about, well, this one's from Japan, that one's from there, and we put it into sort of cultural boxes.
Right.
But I think that was a well-meant attempt to address these people in our classrooms, but it's problematic, and so I think maybe what we're talking about is moving on again into another stage where we are just mindful, perhaps, of the different things that people bring to the classrooms, and perhaps what we need is some kind of intercultural competence as teachers or something. Maybe that's what we're looking for, an awareness rather than absolutist sort of answers. So, yeah.
I think I would ask the question, is it possible to separate the cultural aspect from the language learner? I mean, I think there's heavy cultural influence on why a student chooses to study a language, regardless of where they're from, what national background they come from. I would say that if they want to learn English, for example, if they're in New York City, they want to adjust to living in that environment, or if they're in Kuwait and they want to learn English, what is their motivation for wanting to study English? Is it their family suggesting they do it? Is it because they want to work in a bilingual environment? I mean, I don't see how you can separate culture from the fact that they're in the classroom.
Right. But how many exceptions would you make? Let's say you have a class of 30 and you have 18 different reasons why students are in that classroom. Again, I would still go back to think, well, how does that influence you as a teacher in the classroom? One is being forced, one has chosen, one is fluent, one has no language ability whatsoever. They all have their different cultures and their identities that they're bringing into the classroom, which is, again, why I keep going back to simplifying it and saying, okay, we'll be mindful, just to use your term, about the differences, but still, we still need to teach the students the language. So maybe coming up with some kind of middle ground, but I just think it's difficult. With so many students, it would be difficult to take everyone's identity and background into. I think it's impossible, because it's changing. It's changing.
Do we have any more questions or comments?
I was just going to make the final comment that the classroom is itself culture anyway, isn't it?
That's right.
So, maybe that's another way of looking at it.
Right.
It's what's created culturally as well as what's brought in.
Okay, I'd like to thank Ayesha very much for a very stimulating discussion on globalisation and identity. I think it's made us all think about many different issues, and hopefully, we'll be exploring those issues, and you'll be exploring those issues in your research. So good luck with your research, and
Thank you very much.
Now, Pam, it's lunch.